And so I'm curious about the new or the next transitional government. What are is there support within Haiti for it? And then to that extent, is Haiti are Haitians even being involved in this process?
Yeah, good question. As you can tell kind of from my lengthy rundown of what led us to this point, the Haitian people were really concerned about the consolidation of power in one person. To be clear, no one had any love for the Presidential Transitional Council. So the council was made up of seven voting members and two non-voting members, and a lot of Haitians called it the seven-headed snake because, as I said, it had been quite ineffective and was widely perceived as being corrupt and, in some cases, even colluding with the armed groups, and certainly had made no progress in addressing the insecurity, in reestablishing institutional and government functions, and in moving Haiti towards elections and towards any kind of peace and stability. So the Presidential Transitional Council definitely failed in its responsibility. But as I said, part of the reason it had all these challenges had to do with interference in how it was formulated, including requiring that any members of that council support the multinational security support mission, so the first version of the foreign intervention into Haiti, and requiring that members on that council include certain actors who are, quite demonstrably complicit in Haiti's crisis. So no love for the Presidential Transitional Council. No one misses them. However, Haiti civil society was really concerned about seeing power transferred to just one person. I think there were a lot of really hard conversations about who could credibly lead Haiti, given the challenges that I was undergoing and given the lack of credibility of a lot of people with power right now and sort of their complicity in the current situation. But what Haiti civil society was extremely clear on is that they did not think consolidating power in one person was a good idea. And this was entirely disregarded. And basically, what happened is some members of the Presidential Transitional Council tried to oust the prime minister once the US had signaled that they would like to see him at the head of the transitional government. The US government, in turn, sanctioned those members of the Presidential Transitional Council and ultimately, as I mentioned, literally sent a warship to sail off the coast of Haiti in order to push for their preferred outcome. And their preferred outcome is what happened with, you know, no input as far as any of us can tell from the Haitian people at large. They just didn't have an option about this. And just to make it clear, because I think if you look at some of the coverage about this, it sort of talks about the fact that the term for the Presidential Transitional Council was expiring on February 7th, and that makes it seem like maybe the prime minister had a different level of authority, but he doesn't. So he was appointed by the Presidential Transitional Council. He lacked any sort of outside legitimacy for holding office beyond the fact that he was placed in office by the Presidential Transitional Council and then was supported by all these outside actors. So he currently holds all of the power, and without sort of support from Haitian civil society. And some of the concerns with this, and he sort of, the way he went about consolidating power was inviting a bunch of actors to sign on to what ended up being called the National Pact for Stability and the Organization of Elections. A lot of national parties did sign on to it, but many refused to. And the criticism directed at this pact was that the proposed transitional government headed by Phil May lacks at fixed terms, so it ends only when elections are being held. It lacks effective controls against corruption and abuse, including because it sort of places all the power to monitor this new transitional government's action with the people who agreed to the pact. So it's entirely self-dealing and excludes any people who opposed this approach to transitional government and therefore are most likely to be sort of vigilant critics. And it's a consolidation of power that also contradicts Haiti's constitution that provides for dual executive, as we discussed. Um, the and there's sort of already signs for why that was a justified concern. So the electoral timeline that was promised is already slipping, And since the end of this transitional government is linked to the holding of elections, that also happens to be convenient for those now holding power. You're seeing this sort of next transitional government keeping in place a decree that was issued in December that protects high-level former government officials from accountability for corruption. A concerning development since it basically guts the ability of sort of any judicial entities to hold actors responsible for any corruption. And there's sort of specific concerns about Prime Minister Phil Zemi, who's sort of holding all of this consolidated power, including, as I mentioned, he has a history of connections with some corrupt private sector actors. It's sort of convenient that he spent a lot of money on lobbyists in DC before the US government, decided to support him in his role. And he's been a part of the outgoing transitional government. So a lot of its failed track record of managing security, of sort of failing to tackle state capture by corrupt actors, of failing to hold elections. He was part of that government for a year, so certainly he was, part of the challenges. And he was part of the decision by the government to contract with private military contractors and to bring in the use of drones that have been resulting in significant deaths by civilians. So there's just a lot of concerns about the types of choices and connections that he has, even as the checks on his authority and power have been basically eliminated because the power has been consolidated with him.
And I also want to bring in some of the non-state actors into the picture as well. I think they're kind of just as important to what's happening. How has this kind of militarized the already ongoing crisis? You spoke to this a little bit in your earlier statements. And what sort of dangers specifically for like the civilian population is this bringing? Are we seeing more violence, more crime? Like what kind of numbers has it caused?
Yeah, that's incredibly important context for understanding everything that's happening in Haiti. So, as I sort of alluded to, and as we've talked about in our prior conversations about Haiti, so um, the most sort of visible element of Haiti's crisis is the power taken by armed groups and their seizure of large territories, especially in and around the capital, and sort of their use of that power in order to terrorize civilian populations, extort large amounts of money, and sort of run increasingly criminal enterprises. So all of these efforts by the transitional government, this deployment of international armed forces, have really been ineffective at stemming it. So the situation on the ground is that armed groups continue to control, depending on what estimate you look at, between 75 and 90% of the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area and increasingly the departments around it as well, including Artibonite, which is the kind of the breadbasket for Haiti. So really affecting food supplies there. Central departments really affected as well, increasingly, but it really is radiating out from those areas. But those areas are under really tight control. Armed groups continue to control most roads, if not all roads, in and out of Port-au-Prince. They've really impacted the ability of the airport to function. So there have been large periods of time when the Port-au-Prince airport is effectively non-functional. They have a lot of control over ports. And so all of this, means that armed groups really control the daily lives of a lot of Haitian civilians, including because the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area is really where a lot of Haiti civilians live. They also really control like trade coming in and out of the country. They control food supplies because Haiti is very centralized. So control over Port-au-Prince means really significant control over the rest of the country as well. And this means that they've increasingly sort of branched out into transnational organized crime. So Haiti is becoming a hub of weapons trafficking, of drug trafficking, and the inability by the state to sort of control over this is really contributing to that and enabling it because Haiti's armed groups really grew out of kind of paramilitary forces used by economic and political elites to capture the state or to sort of enable corrupt activities or to capture elections. But they've really kind of metastasized into these more transnational criminal networks. So that very much depends on the groups, and there are many of them, although increasingly they work in coalitions. So there's been less fighting between armed groups and sort of more focus outwards. So that's one bucket of non-state actors, but unfortunately, one of the really troubling aspects of Haiti's crisis over the past year is that there's been a growth of non-state armed actors who are really active in determining the space. And one of those, another subset of those groups are what are civilian defense groups. They really emerged as like neighborhood protection groups who, in the absence of effective state response to these armed groups who were terrorizing neighborhoods, um, took up arms to try to protect their loved ones and their homes. However, sort of in the continued absence of state action, what's happened is that many of these armed groups have shifted in how they behave. Some of it is the product of, fear and lack of government protection. So they're taking matters into their own hands, which is resulting in a lot of extrajudicial killings, oftentimes targeting, sometimes based on no evidence. Other than bias of sort of people perceived as outsiders, because armed groups recruit a lot of young people or children, and especially boys. Sort of any young person who's not familiar can be targeted as a potential member of an armed group, and this results in a lot of killings. And increasingly, these armed groups, these civilian defense groups, sort of work alongside police who are outmanned, outgunned, insufficiently able to address things. So they will collaborate with one another and share intel, which again is, a response to lack of security, but also means that you're seeing sort of state-supported extrajudicial killings of people with no evidence. And there's like a growing number of people who are being killed in this way, in really concerning ways. And kind of a very new element of it is that some of these civil defense groups seem to be turning to crime themselves, and in some cases, even collaborating with armed groups. So some of them are becoming indistinguishable from the armed groups that they arose to fight. And then the third kind of major group of non-state armed actors is, I mentioned them earlier, but the Haitian government has entered into some contracts with basically mercenaries. The known group, and sort of as far as we know, that's really kind of who's playing this role, are the groups belonging to Eric Prince, who, for those of you who remember somewhat recent history, was the Blackwater guy, so not a great track record there. So there are new names and shells for this, but it's the same person operating a very similar type of operation. So the Asian government is paying these private military contractors to fight the armed groups. They are using a lot of kamikaze drones, and dropping them on areas. And the use of these drones has not resulted in sort of any material shift in armed group control of territories. And even though, some of the leaders of these armed groups have, quite large compounds that are visible on Google Maps and everyone knows where they are, somehow those haven't gotten targeted, but we've seen a lot of civilians killed by drone strikes. At least 1,200 people have been killed to date, and documentation supports at least 43 civilians, including 17 children. But the like who's a civilian in this case, as you can hear, is quite complicated. And like I said, a lot of the members of the armed groups are forcibly recruited children. So even armed group membership is quite a complicated criteria by which to do drone targeting. And killings without judicial process are fundamentally unlawful, and problematic. I'll also add to this that a lot of the violence is fueled by the absolutely enormous number of weapons and ammunition in circulation in Haiti, which produces no weapons or ammunition of its own and has been under a weapons embargo for several years. So most of those weapons are illegally brought in from the United States as a direct product of our lax gun laws. And UN estimates that there are upwards of 500,000 weapons in circulation, which is enormous. And so you'll see sort of articles celebrating seizures of weapons by Haitian police, by the MSS, now GSF. Um, but it's usually, something like 33 weapons seized or 43 weapons seized, which relative to the 500,000 in circulation is really peanuts. And I think that doesn't always clearly come across in the reporting and is a really important element of the dynamic to note. And if there weren't these weapons, the scale and the severity of the violence would be really different. And that's a really important thing, especially for us in the United States, to be aware of and to think about targeting.